My older brother raised his crystal champagne glass at his lavish wedding reception, pointing the microphone directly at me while his wealthy new-in-laws watched. "Let us all give a round of applause for my little sister," he announced to the silent ballroom, his voice dripping with mock pity. 35 years old, still single, still splitting rent in a cramped apartment, and still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. The entire room erupted in condescending laughter, including our own parents. I did not cry, and I certainly did not run away. I simply took a slow sip of my drink and smiled, knowing that his new billionaire boss was about to walk through those doors and expose a secret I had kept hidden for 10 years. The reception was being held at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta, the kind of place with towering marble columns, sweeping velvet drapes, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a perfectly manicured golf course bathed in twilight. Every surface seemed to drip with ostentatious wealth, from the massive floral centerpieces overflowing with imported white orchids to the custom gold monogrammed napkins waiting at every seat. It was a space designed to intimidate a fortress of high society that Chloe and her family navigated with effortless entitlement. For my parents, Linda and Warren, it was a stage where they could finally pretend they belonged to a world they had spent their entire lives trying to buy their way into. I was seated at table 14. In the intricate hierarchy of wedding seating arrangements, table 14 was a physical insult. It was strategically wedged into the darkest, draftiest corner of the grand ballroom, positioned exactly between the swinging, heavy wooden doors of the catering kitchen and the main hallway leading to the restrooms. Every few minutes, a harried waiter would bump the back of my chair with a heavy tray of cleared plates, or a draft of cold air would wash over my bare shoulders as guests moved back and forth from the bar. I was completely isolated from the rest of my family, who were seated up at the VIP tables draped in fine silk and bathed in warm spotlight. Being shoved into the shadows was nothing new for me. In the dynamic of our family, I had always been the scapegoat, the afterthought, the background character existing only to make the golden child shine brighter. From my obscured vantage point, I could observe the head tables perfectly. I watched my mother, sitting with perfect rigid posture, trying desperately to mirror the casual elegance of Chloe's mother. My father, Warren, was leaning in too close to Chloe's father, laughing a little too loud at jokes he probably did not even understand. They were practically vibrating with pride, completely intoxicated by the illusion of success that Trey had manufactured for them. To them, Trey was the ultimate achievement. He was handsome, charismatic, and had just landed a director-level position at a prestigious corporate acquisitions firm. They ignored the fact that he was 38 years old and entirely dependent on their constant financial bailouts. They ignored the trail of failed startups, the reckless gambling debts, and the undeniable reality that his charisma was just a shallow mask for a deeply arrogant man. The low hum of jazz music and clinking silverware was suddenly interrupted by the sharp ringing of a silver spoon against a crystal flute. A hush fell over the magnificent room. Trey stood up from his seat at the center of the head table. He adjusted his tailored custom tuxedo, pulling his shoulders back as he surveyed the crowd with the absolute confidence of a man who believed the world revolved around him. He took the microphone from the best man and flashed a blinding practice smile. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Trey began, his deep voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. He spent the first 5 minutes of his speech showering Chloe with compliments, praising her beauty and expressing his profound gratitude to her parents for welcoming him into their family. Then, as he so often did, he pivoted the spotlight directly onto himself. He spoke at length about his journey, his relentless work ethic, and the massive new executive role he had just secured at one of the top financial firms in the country. He spun a beautiful, compelling narrative about being a self-made man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, overcoming every obstacle through pure brilliance and dedication. It was a masterful performance. If I did not know the truth, I might have believed him myself. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the chilled champagne wash over my tongue. I knew what was coming next. Trey could never simply elevate himself. He always needed a stepping stone to stand on, and that stepping stone was usually me. He paced slowly across the polished dance floor, the microphone held close to his mouth. His eyes scanned the room, sweeping past the glamorous guests, the business associates, and the wealthy relatives, until his gaze landed squarely on the dark corner where I sat. The spotlight operator, following his lead, swung a harsh, bright beam of light across the room, pinning me to my seat like a deer caught in headlights. "Now I have talked a lot about success tonight," Trey said, his tone shifting into something dangerously playful. "But I think it is important to remember where we come from and to stay humble." He gestured toward my table, his smile stretching into a cruel smirk. "And there is my little sister Iman." He paused, letting the silence stretch out for maximum theatrical effect. 35 years old, still single, still splitting rent with roommates, and still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. Let us give it up for the late bloomer. The silence hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the ballroom erupted. It started with a low rumble of amusement from Chloe's family and quickly swelled into full-blown condescending laughter. Hundreds of people in designer gowns and expensive suits turned in their chairs to look at the sad single sister hiding in the back corner by the kitchen doors. I could hear the sneers, the whispered comments, the pitying sighs. I looked toward the head table. My mother Linda was shaking her head, her hand covering her mouth as she giggled along with the crowd. My father Warren offered Trey a raised glass and a supportive nod, completely endorsing the public humiliation of his own daughter. They were not defending me. They were not angry. They were actively participating in my degradation simply because it made their golden boy look more accomplished by comparison. In the past, a moment like this would have broken me. The old Iman, the desperate young girl who had spent her entire life begging for a scrap of validation from her parents, would have burst into tears. She would have stood up, knocked over her chair, and run out of the ballroom, seeking refuge in a bathroom stall to cry until her eyes were swollen and her chest ached. But I was not that girl anymore. The woman sitting at table 14 had spent the last decade walking through fire. I had built an empire in absolute silence. I had forged my own armor. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I maintained perfect posture, my spine straight against the back of the uncomfortable chair. I held my champagne flute with a steady hand, feeling the condensation against my fingertips. I raised the glass slightly in a silent toast to my brother and took another slow, measured sip. The sparkling wine was crisp and dry, and I swallowed it with an expression of absolute unbothered calm. At the head table, I saw Chloe lean over to her father. She whispered something behind her hand, her eyes fixed on me. Her expression was a sickening mixture of superiority and false pity. She viewed me as a charity case, a tragic cautionary tale of a woman who had failed at life while she, the beautiful young bride, was ascending to the top of the social ladder with my brilliant brother. I let my free hand drop to my lap, resting my fingers against the smooth, cool leather of my evening clutch. The bag was small, but the documents folded neatly inside of it carried the weight of a nuclear bomb. Bank statements, mortgage deeds, foreclosure notices, and a stack of financial truths that were about to tear this glamorous room apart, piece by piece. I met Chloe's pitying stare across the vast expanse of the ballroom. The corners of my mouth curled upward into a slow, chilling smile. I let my eyes drift from the bride back to my brother, who was still basking in the glow of the crowd's laughter, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire reality was a house of cards. The laughter continued to echo around me, but I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of peace. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the man who held the match to burn it all down was already on his way. I watched as Chloe pushed her chair back from the head table. Her gown, a cascade of white silk and imported lace, rustled heavily as she stood. She whispered something to her new husband, patting his chest before she began her descent from the raised platform. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the beautiful bride made her way across the polished dance floor. She moved with the distinct, unhurried grace of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. Her path was deliberate. She bypassed the tables filled with wealthy investors and influential politicians, marching straight towards the shadowy corner where I sat. As she approached, I could smell her perfume. It was an overpowering blend of crushed roses and money. She stopped in front of table 14, placing one perfectly manicured hand on the back of the empty chair next to me. She looked down at me with a smile so incredibly fake it belonged on a billboard. Her eyes wide and blue held nothing but condescension. "I man," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "I am so glad you decided to come tonight. Trey told me you might feel a little out of place here, but I insisted that family is family." I did not offer her a polite smile in return. I simply looked up at her, waiting for the inevitable insult wrapped in a compliment. "Trey and I were talking earlier today," Chloe continued, leaning down slightly as if speaking to a child. "We are both just so worried about you. He told me all about your living situation and how you are still struggling to find your footing. It breaks my heart to see his sister falling so far behind." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "What exactly did my brother tell you, Chloe?" She sighed, placing a hand over her heart in a theatrical display of empathy. "He told me that you share a cramped apartment with 2 other women just to make rent. He told me you do not have a real career yet. Iman, I want you to know that you do not have to be ashamed. Everyone blooms at their own pace. But I also want to help you. My father owns 3 luxury car dealerships across the state. They are always looking for friendly faces to sit at the front desk. I spoke to him this morning, and he is willing to offer you a receptionist position. It pays $15 an hour, plus benefits. It would be a great way for you to finally get on your feet and stop being such a financial burden on your parents." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the cold air between us. She actually believed she was granting me a life-saving favor. She wanted to play the generous, wealthy savior to her husband's pathetic, struggling sister. She wanted to throw me a minimum wage lifeline so she could brag to her country club friends about her charitable heart. I set my champagne flute down on the table. I looked her directly in the eyes, refusing to let her look down on me. "That is a very generous offer, Chloe," I said, my voice calm and steady. "But I think my brother left a few chapters out of the story he sold you. Did he happen to mention what happened when I was 19 years old?" Chloe frowned, her perfect smile faltering just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about my college fund," I explained, keeping my tone conversational, but sharp enough to cut glass. "I earned a full academic scholarship to my university. I worked night shifts at a diner all through high school to save up $30,000 for my living expenses and future investments. I kept it in a joint account that my parents helped me open when I was a minor." "Did Trey tell you where that money went?" Chloe shifted her weight uncomfortably, her silk gown rustling against the table. "I do not see what this has to do with anything." "It has everything to do with it," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Because I woke up one morning during my sophomore year to find that account completely drained. Every single penny I had scrubbed floors and waited tables to earn was gone. My parents emptied it without my permission. And do you want to know why, Chloe? They emptied my life savings to pay off Trey's massive underground gambling debts and to bail out his second pathetic attempt at a tech startup that never even launched." Chloe's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her shock with a defensive glare. "You are making that up. Trey is a brilliant businessman." "I am not making up anything," I replied smoothly. "My parents allowed me to be evicted from my dorm. They told me that family sacrifices for family, and that Trey just needed a little help to get his genius ideas off the ground. They sacrificed my future to protect his ego. So when you talk about financial burdens, you are looking at the wrong sibling. Trey has been living off our parents for over a decade, draining their retirement accounts dry, while I built my life from absolute scratch." The color began to rise in Chloe's cheeks. Her savior complex was rapidly dissolving, turning into the ugly defensive anger of someone who refused to accept they had been conned. "You are just jealous," she hissed, dropping her voice to an angry whisper, so the surrounding tables would not hear. "You are bitter because Trey made something of himself and you did not. You are sitting here trying to tear down your own brother on his wedding day because you cannot stand the fact that he is successful." "Successful," I repeated, allowing a genuine laugh to escape my lips. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes, successful." Chloe snapped her hands, balling into fists at her sides. "He is a self-made man. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He just landed a director position at one of the biggest corporate acquisitions firms in the country. He earned that through his own hard work and sheer brilliance. He is going to be running that company one day. You are just a sad, lonely woman trying to drag him down to your level." I looked at her flushed, angry face. She believed every single lie he had fed her. She truly believed she was marrying a corporate titan, a man of wealth and vision and immense capability. She had no idea that the prestigious acquisitions firm she was bragging about, the massive company where Trey had supposedly landed his dream job, was the very same empire I had built with my own two hands. She had no idea that I was the majority shareholder, and that her precious self-made groom was nothing more than an entry-level diversity hire I had allowed my CEO to bring on as a sick joke. I did not correct her. I did not tell her the truth yet. The timing had to be absolute perfection. Instead, I simply smiled, the kind of calm, chilling smile that made Chloe take a physical step back from my table. "If you truly believe that, Chloe, then I wish you all the luck in the world," I said softly. "You are going to need every ounce of it." Chloe opened her mouth to snap back at me, but the movement caught the attention of my parents. From across the room, I saw my mother Linda and my father Warren stand up from the head table. They had been watching the interaction, and they could clearly see the furious red flush on the bride's face. In their eyes, I was doing what I always did. I was ruining everything. I was upsetting the wealthy bride and jeopardizing their fragile new connection to high society. My parents did not hesitate. They marched across the ballroom floor, moving with angry, determined strides. Linda's face was twisted in a scowl of pure maternal fury, while Warren clenched his jaw, looking ready to drag me out of the building by my arm. They bypassed the elegant centerpieces and the laughing guests, storming straight into the dark corner of table 14. They were coming to protect the bride, to defend the golden child, and to put the ungrateful scapegoat back in her place. They were coming to demand I show proper gratitude for the insulting receptionist job I had just been offered. And as they closed the distance, I kept my hands resting lightly on my clutch, waiting for the storm to break. My mother reached the table first. Linda moved with a rigid, terrifying speed, her expensive beaded gown shimmering under the dim lights of the service corridor. Her face was pulled tight into a mask of maternal fury, perfectly concealed from the rest of the ballroom, but aimed entirely at me. My father Warren stood right behind her, his broad shoulders squared like a bouncer preparing to eject an unruly patron. "What is wrong with you?" my mother hissed. Her voice was a sharp, controlled whisper, designed to cut deep without drawing the attention of the wealthy guests seated just a few yards away. I did not stand up to meet her anger. I simply looked at her, taking in the defensive posture she always assumed whenever Trey was threatened. "I have not done anything wrong, Mother," I replied, my tone completely even. "I was simply having a conversation with the bride." "A conversation?" my mother spat back, leaning her hands on the table. "You were making her uncomfortable. Chloe came over here out of the goodness of her heart to offer you a lifeline, and you sit here looking at her like she is dirt on your shoe. You are embarrassing this family, Iman. Look at you." She gestured wildly at my outfit, her eyes scanning me with blatant disgust. "You wore that plain, simple dress just to look miserable. You are sitting back here in the dark sulking, while your brother is having the best night of his entire life. You could not just put on a bright smile and pretend to be happy for him. You always have to make everything about your own failures." I looked down at my dress. It was a custom-tailored piece of understated luxury cut from the finest Italian silk. But to my mother, it lacked the flashy sequins and loud branding she associated with success. She could not recognize quiet wealth if it stared her right in the face. "Your brother is a director now, my father." Warren chimed in, his voice a low rumble of disappointment. "He is marrying into a family with real influence. Chloe's father is a very generous man. He was willing to give you a job at his dealership, a good, stable job. You should be down on your knees thanking that young woman for trying to pull you out of the gutter. Instead, you bring up ancient history and try to make Trey look bad." "Ancient history." I repeated the words, tasting bitter on my tongue. "Is that what we are calling my stolen college fund now? A minor historical inconvenience. We did what we had to do to protect this family." My mother snapped, her eyes flashing with defensive rage. "Trey just needed a little capital to get his footing. We raised you better than to hold grudges over money. You need to learn from your brother Iman. You need to stop being so stubborn and look at what he has achieved. He networked his way to the top. If you had half his ambition, you would not be splitting rent in some cramped apartment at 35 years old. Now get up, walk over to that head table, and apologize to your sister-in-law." I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer audacity of her command wash over me. She wanted me to apologize to a woman who had just insulted me. She wanted me to grovel to protect the fragile ego of the son who had robbed me blind. I will not be apologizing to anyone, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, quiet register that made my father take a step back. And I will certainly not thank a woman for offering me a minimum wage job when I have built a life she could not even begin to comprehend. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical outrage. You ungrateful little brat. Before she could launch into another tirade, a shadow fell over the table. Trey had noticed the commotion from the dance floor. He could not stand the idea of any drama ruining his perfect image, so he had excused himself from his adoring fans and strode over to our corner. To the rest of the room, he looked like the perfect, gracious groom coming to check on his family. He flashed a brilliant white smile, waving to a nearby photographer before turning his back to the cameras. The moment he faced me, the smile vanished entirely. His handsome features contorted into a nasty, arrogant sneer. What is going on here? Trey demanded, keeping his voice low. Your sister is refusing to apologize to Chloe, my mother said quickly, eager to tattle on me, to the golden child. She was bringing up that old bank account again. She is trying to ruin your night, Trey. Trey let out a harsh, breathless laugh. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of my chair, trapping me in my seat. His expensive cologne was thick and cloying, filling the small space between us. Listen to me very carefully, Iman. Trey hissed, his breath hot against my face. I do not care how bitter you are. I do not care how much you resent my success. Tonight is about me. I am marrying into a family that has more money and power than you will ever see in your lifetime. I just secured an executive role at a company that buys and sells people like you for sport. You are going to keep your mouth shut. I looked him dead in the eyes, refusing to break contact. You are very confident for a man who builds his castles on quicksand, Trey. Trey scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. You are pathetic. You are literally sitting by the kitchen doors acting like you know anything about the real world. If you cannot smile and act normal, then take your cheap little purse and get out of my wedding. I will not let your jealousy taint my networking opportunities. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let my fingers graze the leather of my clutch, feeling the sharp edges of the financial documents hidden inside. Trey suddenly checked the heavy gold watch on his wrist. It was a fake Rolex, a detail I had noticed the moment he walked down the aisle. His entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The arrogant sneer melted away, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. He stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of his tuxedo and running a hand over his freshly cut hair. He turned to our parents, his voice tight with sudden panic. Mom. Dad, straighten up. I just got a text from his assistant. Elijah is here. My mother gasped, her eyes widening with excitement. The CEO of your new firm, the billionaire. Yes, Trey said hurriedly, checking his reflection in a nearby mirror. He is the most powerful man in the acquisitions industry. The fact that he RSVP'd to my wedding is a massive deal. I need to make sure his reception is absolutely flawless. He can make or break my entire career track. Trey turned back to me, pointing a rigid finger directly at my face. You stay right here, Iman. Do not move from this table. Do not speak to anyone. If you embarrass me in front of Elijah, I swear to God I will make sure you never hear from this family again. Keep your mouth shut and stay in the shadows where you belong. He did not wait for my response. He turned on his heel, practically sprinting back toward the grand entrance of the ballroom, his parents trailing excitedly right behind him. They were eager to bask in the glow of the billionaire executive, desperate to be seen rubbing shoulders with true corporate royalty. I remained at table 14, completely alone once again. I picked up my champagne flute and took a slow, satisfying sip. I watched the grand entrance, waiting for the exact moment the tide would turn. At the far end of this ballroom, the heavy oak double doors suddenly swung open. The ambient noise of the wedding reception immediately died down, replaced by a collective hush of awe and curiosity as the most anticipated guest of the evening finally arrived. The man who stepped through those heavy oak doors commanded the room without having to utter a single syllable. Elijah was 42 years old and possessed the kind of quiet, absolute authority that cannot be faked or purchased. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, a stark contrast to the rented tuxedos and flashy designer labels crowding the country club. As an African-American man who had shattered glass ceilings to build a corporate empire, he carried himself with an effortless grace that immediately demanded respect. The ambient chatter in the grand ballroom died down to a breathless whisper. I watched from my dark corner as the wealthy guests turned in their seats, craning their necks to get a look at the billionaire CEO they had only read about in financial magazines. Chloe and her snobbish parents sat up entirely straight, their expressions morphing from arrogant boredom into eager anticipation. They recognized power when they saw it, and they were absolutely desperate to be near it. But no one was more desperate than my brother. Trey practically shoved his new bride aside the moment he spotted his target. The arrogant scowl he had aimed at me just seconds ago vanished completely. It was replaced by a sycophantic, eager grin that made him look like a starving dog, begging for a scrap from the master table. He smoothed down his lapels, shot his cuffs, and stepped onto the polished dance floor. He moved with a rushed, frantic energy that completely betrayed his carefully crafted illusion of success. I sat perfectly still at table 14, watching the train wreck unfold in slow motion. Trey marched directly into the center of the room, intercepting Elijah before the CEO could even take 5 steps past the entrance. My brother puffed out his chest, trying to project an air of mutual respect and collegial familiarity. He thrust his right hand forward, a massive, eager smile plastered across his face, ready to welcome the man who held the keys to his entire fabricated future. What happened next was a masterpiece of silent devastation. Elijah did not break his stride. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. He looked at Trey the same way one might look at a minor obstruction on a sidewalk, without shifting his facial expression. Elijah smoothly sidestepped my brother, completely ignoring the outstretched hand. He walked right past Trey, leaving the golden child of our family standing frozen in the middle of the dance floor, with his hands suspended in empty air. The collective gasp from the room was audible. Chloe dropped her jaw, staring in absolute horror as her self-made groom was publicly dismissed like a nuisance. My mother Linda let out a small, strangled noise of panic, clutching my father Warren by the arm. They watched their son swallow the bitter pill of public humiliation, his eager smile shattering into a mask of pure mortified shock. Trey slowly lowered his hand, his face burning with a dark red flush of embarrassment, as hundreds of wealthy guests witnessed his rejection. But Elijah was not finished dismantling the illusions of the evening. He continued his measured, confident stride across the ballroom floor. He bypassed the front row where the bridal party sat in stunned silence. He walked right past the VIP tables, ignoring the eager nods and polite smiles of the local politicians and business elites who had hoped to catch his eye. He navigated the intricate maze of lavish centerpieces and crystal glassware, moving with absolute purpose. The crowd parted for him instinctively. Whispers broke out among the guests as they tried to figure out where the most powerful man in the room was going. I watched my parents panic from afar. Linda and Warren actually stepped away from their table, attempting to position themselves in Elijah's path to intercept him and salvage their son's dignity. But Elijah did not even grant them a passing glance. He walked right through their line of sight, leaving them sputtering in his wake. I was heading into the shadows. He was walking directly toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. He was marching straight toward table 14. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Chloe actually stood up from her chair, her silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room, her eyes tracking the billionaire as he crossed the final stretch of the floor. Trey spun around on his heels, his panic morphing into sheer terror as he realized the trajectory of his boss. My brother knew I was sitting back there. He had specifically ordered me to stay hidden in the dark to avoid ruining his networking opportunity. Now the very man he was desperate to impress was hunting me down. I did not stand up. I remained comfortably seated in my chair, my hands resting lightly on the clutch that held the financial documents. I watched the confident, familiar stride of my colleague, my friend, and my subordinate. Elijah stopped directly in front of my small drafty table. The harsh spotlight that Trey had previously ordered the DJ to shine on me was still illuminating my corner, casting a dramatic glow over the scene. The cold, imposing demeanor that Elijah had carried across the ballroom vanished the moment he looked at me. His sharp eyes softened, and a genuine warm smile broke across his face. He did not care about the hundreds of people staring at us. He did not care about the bride or the panicked parents or the groom sweating profusely on the dance floor. He only cared about the woman sitting at the table. Elijah leaned down and pulled me into a fierce, warm embrace. I stood up to return the hug, wrapping my arms around the man who had helped me build my empire in absolute secrecy. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, deafening, and perfect. The entire hierarchy of my family, the decades of gaslighting and the cruel narrative they had constructed about my failures, shattered the moment the billionaire CEO wrapped his arms around the family scapegoat. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief second, letting the profound, sweet satisfaction of the moment wash over me before pulling back to deliver the first fatal blow to my brother's crumbling world. Elijah held me in a genuine embrace that felt like a shield against the toxicity in the room. The scent of his expensive cedar and bergamot cologne cut through the stale air of the catering corridor. For 10 years, I had kept my professional life and my personal life completely segregated. I had built a fortress around my business to protect it from the grasping, greedy hands of my parents and my brother. Letting Elijah into this ballroom was the first time those two worlds had ever collided. The reality of my actual life, the life where I was respected, valued, and powerful, was finally bleeding into the fake, carefully curated illusion my family had constructed. I hugged him back, feeling a profound sense of grounding. When Elijah finally stepped back, he kept his hands on my shoulders, giving them a firm, supportive squeeze. He did not lower his voice to a private whisper. He spoke with the clear, projecting tone of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and holding the attention of hundreds. "Sorry I am late, Iman," Elijah said, a warm and easy smile crossing his face. "The jet got delayed on the tarmac in Chicago, and the traffic coming from the private airstrip was a nightmare. You ready to sign off on the merger on Monday, boss?" The word hung in the air like a physical weight, boss. It was a single syllable, but it struck the ballroom with the force of a tectonic shift. The profound silence that had settled over the country club deepened into something heavy and suffocating. No one moved. The waiters stood frozen, holding trays of champagne. The wedding photographer lowered his camera. The wealthy guests who had been laughing at my expense just moments ago were now staring in absolute unblinking shock. Their brains were actively struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding in front of them. The billionaire chief executive officer, the man they had all been whispering about and hoping to impress, had just bypassed the entire upper crust of Atlanta society to bow his head to the quiet single woman sitting by the kitchen doors. I looked past Elijah's shoulder to observe the head table. Chloe was gripping the edge of the white linen tablecloth so tightly her knuckles had turned completely pale. The condescending pity that had painted her face only a few minutes earlier was entirely gone. It was replaced by a frantic, darting confusion. She looked at her father, the man who had supposedly offered me a minimum-wage receptionist job as a charity case. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide as he stared at Elijah. He recognized corporate deference when he saw it. He knew exactly what it looked like when a powerful man reported to someone even more powerful. My parents were a portrait of pure panic. Linda had half risen from her chair, her hands clutching the pearl necklace at her throat as if she were struggling to breathe. Warren was gripping his water glass, staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. They had spent my entire life convincing themselves and everyone else that I was a failure. They had drained my college fund, belittled my ambitions, and relegated me to the shadows so Trey could shine. Now the very foundation of their reality was cracking right before their eyes, and they had absolutely no idea how to stop it. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to my brother. Trey was standing exactly where Elijah had left him, in the middle of the polished wooden dance floor. He was physically paralyzed. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his mouth was parted in a silent gasp. The arrogant strut, the puffed-out chest, the mocking sneer, all of it had evaporated. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take hold. His eyes darted from Elijah's custom suit to my simple silk dress, trying desperately to make sense of the interaction. I smoothed the front of my dress and stood up from my chair. I moved with deliberate, unhurried grace. I did not glare at my family, and I did not gloat. I simply slipped into the persona I wore every single day in the corporate world. I became the woman who bought and sold companies for a living. I became the architect of my own empire. I smiled warmly at Elijah, picking up my clutch from the table. The merger documents are fully prepared and waiting on your desk, Elijah. I replied, my voice carrying easily across the silent room. We will review the final assets at 9 on Monday morning. But right now we are at a wedding, and I do not believe you have had the pleasure of formally meeting the groom. I turned my body and extended an elegant open hand toward the center of the dance floor. I gestured to my brother, who was currently sweating through his rented tuxedo. Elijah, I said, my tone perfectly pleasant and entirely lethal. Please meet my older brother, Trey. Elijah turned around slowly. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked at Trey. The warm, friendly demeanor Elijah had shown me vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a chief executive officer evaluating an employee. Elijah's eyes swept over Trey, taking in the frantic panic on his face, the fake gold watch on his wrist, and the desperate trembling of his hands. Trey swallowed hard. He tried to force his signature charismatic smile, but his facial muscles betrayed him, resulting in a weak, terrified grimace. He took a hesitant step forward, lifting his hand once again in a pathetic attempt to salvage the introduction. Mr. CEO. Trey stammered, his voice cracking noticeably on the microphone he was still clutching in his other hand. It is an absolute honor, sir. I am the new director of regional acquisitions. I just joined your firm last month. Elijah did not look at Trey's extended hand. He did not smile. He simply stared at my brother with a look of profound, dawning realization. The silence stretched out thick and agonizing as Elijah connected the dots in his head. He looked from Trey to me and then back to Trey. Elijah did not whisper. He did not try to save my brother's pride. He spoke with absolute clarity, ensuring his voice carried to the head table, to Chloe, to my parents, and to every single wealthy guest who had laughed at me. Wait, Iman, Elijah said, his brow furrowing in disgust as he addressed me. This is the brother you told me about. Trey froze, his hand still hanging in the air. Elijah shook his head, a harsh laugh escaping his lips as he looked my brother up and down. This is the guy whose resume you asked me to push through human resources as a pity favor. The words pity favor hung in the heavy air of the grand ballroom, slicing through the sophisticated atmosphere with the brutal precision of a newly sharpened blade. Trey stood completely paralyzed in the center of the polished dance floor, his arms still awkwardly suspended in the space between us. His face rapidly drained of all its color, turning a sickly ashen shade as his brain catastrophically short-circuited. He looked from Elijah to me and then back to Elijah, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly like a fish pulled desperately from the water. I was entirely incapable of comprehending the sheer magnitude of his sudden humiliation. The brilliant self-made corporate titan, the golden boy, who had just spent 10 minutes bragging to a room full of millionaires, had just been reduced to an entry-level charity case in front of his wealthy new-in-laws. The spell of stunned silence was abruptly broken by the frantic, sharp clicking of my mother's designer heels against the hardwood floor. Linda and Warren had finally snapped out of their temporary paralysis. They simply could not process the truth, because accepting the truth meant acknowledging my ultimate power and their own profound parental failures. It meant admitting that they had bet their entire retirement on the wrong child. So they chose the path they always chose whenever Trey was backed into a corner. They chose absolute, aggressive, and theatrical denial. My parents rushed across the dance floor, moving with a frantic, desperate energy. They placed themselves protectively in front of Trey, acting as a human shield against the reality of the situation. My mother shoved her finger in my direction. Her face twisted into a deeply unpleasant mask of maternal fury. She deliberately raised her voice, ensuring her words carried to the surrounding tables, desperately trying to seize control of the spiraling narrative. What kind of sick, elaborate joke is this, Iman? My mother demanded, her chest heaving with exaggerated outrage. How dare you pull a cruel stunt like this at your brother's wedding? You are so bitterly jealous of his success that you actually went out and hired a fake executive to humiliate him in front of his new family. She turned away from me and addressed the staring crowd, forcing a tight, hysterical laugh that echoed awkwardly through the silent room. She hired an actor, my mother announced, waving her hand dismissively toward Elijah. My sad, lonely daughter hired a fake billionaire just to ruin the best night of her brother's life, because she simply cannot stand to see him happy and successful. My father stepped forward immediately, puffing out his broad chest as he glared at Elijah. Warren tried to look physically intimidating, completely unaware of how ridiculous he appeared. He was attempting to bully a man who commanded global boardrooms and managed billions of dollars in assets before his morning coffee. "You need to leave this venue right now, buddy," my father ordered, pointing a rigid finger toward the heavy oak exit doors. "I do not know how much my desperate daughter paid you to come in here and spout these ridiculous lies, but your little performance is officially over. Get out of this country club before I have security throw you out onto the street." Elijah did not even blink. He did not step back, and he certainly did not look intimidated. He looked at my parents with a mixture of mild amusement and profound, genuine pity. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, completely unfazed by their pathetic attempts at intimidation. He stood his ground right next to my chair, remaining a silent, unwavering pillar of support, while my biological family aggressively unraveled in front of me. The loud commotion had finally drawn the direct attention of the bridal party. Chloe gathered the heavy, layered skirts of her silk Vera Wang gown and stormed over to our dark corner. Her face was blotchy and red, fueled by a very misplaced sense of righteous anger. Right behind her marched her father, a man who wore his generational wealth like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He strode into our tense circle, radiating the kind of arrogant, unearned authority that only comes from a lifetime of unchallenged privilege. Chloe's father aggressively pushed past my parents, placing himself directly in front of my table. He looked down his nose at me, his pale blue eyes sweeping over my simple tailored dress with absolute unfiltered disdain. "This is the most ridiculous, pathetic display I have ever witnessed," he sneered, his voice booming with arrogant certainty. He turned his attention to Elijah, letting out a harsh, condescending scoff that was meant to belittle both of us. "Do you really expect any of the educated people in this room to believe this absolute garbage? Look at her." He gestured toward me with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. "I know exactly who this woman is because Trey warned us all about her erratic behavior. She does not own a massive corporate acquisitions firm. She does not even own her own house. She is 35 years old, and she lives with roommates in a cramped shared apartment because she cannot even afford to pay her own rent. She is a financial disaster, making up elaborate fantasies to steal the spotlight from her brother." The wealthy guests seated at the nearby tables began to murmur in quiet agreement. My mother's frantic lie was rapidly taking hold among the country club elite. To them, it made perfect logical sense. It was much easier to believe that the quiet single black woman sitting in the dark corner by the kitchen doors was a delusional, jealous liar than to accept that they had all been totally fooled by the charismatic, handsome groom. Encouraged by the shifting dynamic of the crowd, Trey finally seemed to find his voice. He peeked out from behind the protective barrier of our parents, regaining a tiny, pathetic fraction of his false bravado. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his breathing heavy and uneven. "You are entirely pathetic," Iman Trey spat, the venom clear in his voice. "You are so desperate for a single ounce of attention that you are making up these insane, psychotic fantasies. You share an apartment with 2 other women. You are a broke, miserable loser who could not even afford to buy a decent dress for my wedding." I let the vicious insults wash over me like water over stone. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not try to argue with the furious bride or her arrogant, entitled father. I certainly did not waste a single breath trying to convince my deeply delusional parents of my reality. I remained perfectly calm, sitting as a serene, unbothered island, in the middle of their chaotic, desperate emotional storm. I simply reached into my small leather clutch and pulled out my cell phone. I kept my eyes locked directly on Chloe's father, holding his furious gaze as I tapped a single pre-written message on my screen and hit send. I slid the phone back into my bag, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I offered him a slow, knowing smile that caused the confident sneer to falter slightly on his face. I turned my head, looking past the furious bridal party, past my shaking brother, and toward the heavy oak doors at the grand entrance of the ballroom. "Actually," I said, my voice smooth, measured, and perfectly pitched to cut cleanly through the heavy, suffocating tension of the room. You are absolutely right about one thing, sir. I do live with roommates. But I think you should meet them before you decide just how broke I really am. Because my roommates are already here. The entire grand ballroom turned instinctively toward the heavy oak doors at the main entrance, expecting another grand arrival, but the doors remained completely still. My text message had not been sent to someone waiting outside the venue. It had been sent to the two women who had been sitting quietly just 2 tables away from me, blending perfectly into the dim shadows of the catering corridor for the entire evening. Keisha and Jasmine pushed their chairs back and stood up simultaneously. The scraping of their chairs against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the dead silent room. Up until this very second, my family and Chloe's arrogant relatives had completely ignored them. To my parents, they were just my sad, broke friends who had tagged along to eat free wedding food. For the entire evening, Keisha and Jasmine had been wearing plain, modest wool overcoats draped over their shoulders, deliberately concealing themselves to keep a low profile until the absolute perfect moment. That moment had officially arrived. Keisha reached up and unbuttoned her plain gray overcoat, slipping it smoothly off her shoulders. Jasmine mirrored the movement, letting her simple black trench coat fall away. A waiter who had been frozen nearby rushed forward on pure instinct to catch the coats before they hit the floor. With the cheap outer layers removed, the true reality of my best friends was suddenly and violently exposed to the glaring lights of the ballroom. They were not wearing off-the-rack department store dresses. Keisha stood tall in a breathtaking, custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that hugged her curves and radiated an aura of pure generational wealth. The fabric caught the light like liquid glass. Jasmine stood beside her in a sleek, structured crimson-red dress with a sharp, asymmetrical neckline that made her look like a ruthless corporate shark wrapped in high fashion. They wore diamonds that did not sparkle with fake cubic zirconia desperation, but with the heavy, undeniable weight of real, flawless stones. They were two incredibly stunning, powerful African-American women who looked like they owned the entire building. The two of them began to walk toward my table. They moved in perfect synchronization, their designer heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. They did not rush, and they did not look intimidated by the hundreds of wealthy white guests staring at them. They carried themselves with the exact same predatory grace as Elijah, who respectfully took half a step back to open the circle and let them join me. My mother, Linda, blinked rapidly, her face scrunching up in profound confusion. She recognized my friends, of course, but her brain was entirely incapable of reconciling the two women she knew with the two titans currently walking across the floor. In my mother's mind, Keisha was just the girl who used to help me study for exams, and Jasmine was just the quiet girl who liked to read thick books on our living room couch. My mother had spent years making passive-aggressive comments about how the three of us were going to end up as old, lonely spinsters, sharing a tiny apartment to afford groceries. Trey looked equally bewildered. His eyes darted from Keisha's emerald gown to Jasmine's diamond necklace. The fake confident smirk he had worn all night was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling paranoia. He knew how much things cost, and he knew that the women standing in front of him were wearing more money than he made in an entire year. Chloe's father, however, refused to back down. He puffed out his chest, his face turning an angry shade of red. He looked at Keisha and Jasmine with absolute, unfiltered disdain, unable to fathom that these black women could possibly hold any real power over him or his perfect daughter. "Is this supposed to be some kind of joke?" Chloe's father demanded, his voice booming across the silent tables. "You call your little roommates over here to back up your ridiculous lies. What are they going to do, Iman? Are they going to pretend they own fake companies too? Are they going to tell us how you all pool your minimum wage paychecks just to keep the lights on in your cramped little apartment?" I did not answer him. I simply smiled and took a step back, letting my friends handle the introduction. Keisha stopped directly in front of Chloe's father. She looked him up and down with a slow, clinical precision that made him shift uncomfortably on his feet. She did not raise her voice, but she spoke with a cold, authoritative edge that commanded the entire room. "My name is Keisha Washington," she said, her voice ringing out crystal clear. "And I do not pool minimum wage paychecks, sir. I manage corporate wealth. I am the chief financial officer of the acquisitions firm that your new son-in-law just begged to join." I am the woman who personally reviewed Trey's pathetic credit score and laughed out loud before I stamped his approval paperwork purely as a favor to my best friend. The ballroom gasped. Chloe's father took a physical step backward, his arrogant posture crumbling under the weight of Keisha's words. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Jasmine stepped forward next, her crimson dress standing out like blood against the white tablecloths. She fixed her sharp legal gaze directly on Chloe, who was trembling so hard her expensive veil was shaking. "And my name is Jasmine Carter," she added, her tone as smooth and lethal as a drawn blade. "I am the chief legal counsel for the same firm. I am the person who drafted the non-disclosure agreements your husband signed. I am the person who legally binds and dissolves multi-million-dollar corporate mergers before lunch. And just for the record, I am also the person who currently holds the legal documentation proving exactly how much debt your new husband is hiding from you." Trey let out a strangled, pathetic noise that sounded like a dying animal. He looked desperately at Elijah, hoping the billionaire CEO would step in and stop this madness. He hoped Elijah would expose us as frauds and restore order to the universe. Instead, Elijah simply smiled, putting a supportive hand on Keisha's shoulder. He looked at Trey with absolute disgust. "You should really pay more attention to the corporate hierarchy of the company you work for." Elijah said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "I may be the chief executive officer, but these three women own the absolute majority of the shareholder equity. I report to them. They built the empire. I just manage the daily operations." The reality of the situation crashed down on the head table like a collapsing building. My parents, Linda and Warren, looked as though they were going to physically faint. Their knees buckled slightly, and Warren had to grab the back of a nearby chair just to keep himself upright. They had spent a decade funding Trey's miserable failures while treating me like a pathetic burden. They had allowed me to be publicly mocked by an entire room full of strangers because they truly believed I was a broke loser. Now they were staring at the irrefutable proof that their scapegoat daughter and her two best friends were the most powerful, wealthy people in the entire country club. Chloe could not handle it. Her fragile, carefully constructed world of white privilege and high society superiority was being violently ripped apart by three black women she had tried to humiliate. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage and denial. She gripped the heavy skirts of her Vera Wang gown and took a step toward me, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical scream that echoed painfully off the high ceilings. "You are lying!" Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. "You are all lying. This is a sick, twisted setup. Trey told me everything about you. He told me you are a broke, miserable spinster. You three live in a shared apartment. You split rent. You do not own a massive firm. You do not have millions of dollars. You are just a group of pathetic, delusional roommates trying to ruin my wedding day because you are jealous of what I have." The silence that followed her hysterical outburst was heavy and uncomfortable. Even Chloe's own parents looked slightly embarrassed by her complete loss of composure. I looked at Keisha and Jasmine. We did not look angry. We looked deeply, profoundly amused. Jasmine tilted her head, her crimson dress catching the light as she offered Chloe a slow, predatory smile. It was the exact smile she used in the boardroom right before she gutted an opposing legal team and left them with absolutely nothing. "You are right about one small detail, Chloe," Jasmine said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "We do live together, but we definitely do not split rent." Jasmine calmly reached into the sleek leather bag tucked under her arm. She did not pull out a tissue or a compact mirror. She pulled out a silver iPad. She unlocked the screen with a quick tap of her finger, never once taking her eyes off the furious, weeping bride standing in front of us. She adjusted her grip on the device, her predatory smile widening as she prepared to drop the evidence that would finally silence this miserable family once and for all. Jasmine held the silver iPad in her left hand, her crimson red dress flowing beautifully as she took a commanding step toward the center of our tense circle. The entire ballroom was dead silent, watching her every move. Behind the expansive head table where my brother and his bride had been sitting like fake royalty sat the DJ's massive entertainment setup. They had rented a huge digital projection screen, originally intended to play a slideshow of Trey and Chloe's perfectly curated, heavily filtered engagement photos. Jasmine did not even look at the DJ. She simply tapped a sequence of commands onto her screen, overriding the local Bluetooth connection with the swift, brutal efficiency of a corporate lawyer who left absolutely nothing to chance. The massive digital screen flickered for a fraction of a second. The slideshow of smiling, happy faces vanished. It was instantly replaced by the stark, high-definition image of a highly classified, certified legal document. The stark white background and heavy black text loomed over the entire ballroom like a giant, undeniable billboard of truth. Jasmine turned her sharp gaze back to Chloe's father, who was currently staring up at the screen with his mouth hanging slightly open. "You were making some rather bold assumptions about Iman's living situation," Jasmine said, her voice echoing clearly across the tables. "You called her a broke loser. You claimed we pool our minimum wage paychecks just to afford a cramped apartment. I am the chief legal counsel for our firm, so I prefer to deal exclusively in documented, verifiable facts. What you are looking at on that screen behind you is a certified property deed recorded with the city exactly 3 years ago." Chloe's father squinted up at the heavy legal text, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple as his brain struggled to process the numbers printed on the screen. Jasmine began to read the document aloud, just to make sure there was absolutely no confusion. "That is the deed to the Olympus Tower penthouse. It is a triplex unit occupying the top 3 floors of one of the most exclusive and secure residential buildings in the downtown financial district. It features 12,000 square feet of living space, a private rooftop infinity pool, and a dedicated security team. The purchase price, as you can clearly see on line 4 of that document, was exactly $50 million. The ballroom erupted into a chorus of shocked murmurs. Guests were pulling out their reading glasses, leaning forward in their expensive chairs, trying to get a better look at the massive numbers projected over the dance floor. Jasmine was not finished. She tapped her screen again, zooming in on the bottom section of the legal document, highlighting the signatures and the ownership percentages. "If you look closely at the ownership structure," Jasmine continued, her tone mockingly polite, "you will notice that there is no mortgage associated with this property. There is no bank loan. There are no investors. The property was purchased entirely in cash, and the ownership is split 3 ways evenly between Keisha, myself, and Iman. So you are technically correct, sir. We do live together in a shared space, but we absolutely do not split rent. We own the building." The profound shift in power hit the room with the force of a physical blow. The illusion of Ray's superiority. The entire foundation upon which he had built this glamorous fake life began to aggressively and violently crumble. Chloe's wealthy family had walked into this country club believing they were the absolute apex of the social hierarchy. They believed they were graciously allowing my self-made brother into their elite circle while treating me like an unfortunate piece of garbage on the bottom of their shoes. Now Chloe's father was staring at irrefutable proof that he was not the richest person in the room. He was not even close. The quiet, single black woman he had just tried to humiliate by offering a receptionist job was a woman of immense, staggering generational wealth. She possessed the kind of liquid capital that his luxury car dealerships could only dream of generating. His shoulders slumped, his arrogant posture completely deflating as the reality of his massive miscalculation washed over him. I shifted my gaze to my parents. Linda and Warren looked like they had been physically struck by lightning. My mother was gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her eyes were locked onto the $50 million figure projected on the screen. She was actively doing the math in her head, realizing that the daughter she had spent decades calling a failure, the daughter whose college fund she had stolen, was sitting on a mountain of wealth. Warren looked physically sick. He looked from the screen to me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. For years they had paraded Trey around as their ultimate accomplishment, pouring every cent they had into his endless string of failures. They had allowed Trey to treat me like a servant. Now they were staring at the cold, hard proof that they had backed the wrong horse. I had built an empire right under their noses, and I had deliberately shut them out of it. Chloe was shaking violently. Her perfect bridal facade was completely shattered. She looked at the screen and then looked at her father, begging him silently to prove that this was all a trick. But her father just stood there looking humiliated and small. The realization that she was not marrying the most successful person in the room, that she was actually marrying the pathetic, deeply insecure brother of a corporate titan, was breaking her brain. She had built her entire wedding day around being the center of attention, around being the wealthy, generous bride, extending a hand to the poor, pathetic sister. Now she was nothing more than a footnote in my success story. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every single eye was glued to the massive screen displaying my $50 million penthouse. The air was thick with the undeniable reality of my power. And then my brother completely snapped. Trey could not handle it. He could not handle the fact that the spotlight had been ripped away from him. He could not handle the fact that his wealthy new-in-laws were looking at him not with admiration, but with intense, suspicious scrutiny. The carefully constructed mask of the confident corporate director cracked and fell apart entirely. Trey stepped forward, his face dripping with sweat. His designer tuxedo suddenly looked ill-fitting and cheap on his trembling frame. He frantically wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to claw back a tiny fraction of his dignity. "So what?" Trey shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed across the silent ballroom. "So what if you got lucky on a few business deals, Iman? So what if you live in some fancy apartment? That does not change anything about me." He turned to Chloe and her father, waving his arms frantically, trying to redirect their attention away from the glaring projection of my wealth. "I am still a self-made man," Trey declared, his voice rising into a desperate, panicked shriek. "I earned my position. I built my career from the ground up without any help from anyone. I am the one who pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I am a massive success." Trey pounded a fist against his chest, his eyes wild and unhinged. "Look at this wedding!" he screamed, gesturing wildly around the lavish ballroom, the towering floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers. "Look at what I provided for my bride. I paid for this entire event. I dropped $150,000 out of my own pocket to give Chloe the wedding of her dreams because I am a successful provider. You cannot take that away from me." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate, pathetic shouting wash over the crowd. I looked at the sweat dripping down his temples and the wild, terrified look in his eyes. He was clinging to his last remaining life raft. He was begging his new family to believe that he was still the wealthy, independent provider he had claimed to be. I slowly opened my leather clutch, feeling the thick stack of financial documents waiting inside. The trap was fully sprung, and it was time to let it snap shut. The echo of my brother's desperate boast hung in the air of the grand ballroom. $150,000. He had screamed the number with such frantic intensity that his voice had cracked, stripping away the smooth, polished facade of the corporate director he was pretending to be. He stood there panting heavily, the expensive fabric of his rented tuxedo clinging to his sweating frame. He was begging the room to believe him. He was begging his wealthy new-in-laws to focus on the money he claimed to have spent, rather than the staggering $50 million reality projected on the screen behind him. I did not immediately respond to his outburst. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the sheer pathetic nature of his claim to settle over the crowd. I slowly turned my gaze away from my brother and shifted my attention directly to Chloe's father. The older man was currently staring at Trey with a deep, unsettling mixture of suspicion and lingering arrogance. He was a man who had built his entire identity on wealth and status, and he was currently trying to calculate if the man marrying his daughter was actually a titan of industry or a complete fraud. I looked Chloe's father dead in the eye and asked a very simple question. "Is that what Trey told you?" I asked, my voice projecting clearly across the silent space. "Did he look you in the face and tell you that he paid for this wedding out of his own pocket?" Chloe's father bristled at my directness. He squared his shoulders instinctively, trying to reclaim the upper hand in a room where he had just been profoundly outclassed. He lifted his chin and spoke with a defensive, haughty tone. "Yes, he did," Chloe's father announced loudly, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear him. "Trey insisted on financing this entire event. He told us he wanted to handle the venue, the catering, and the floral arrangements to prove he was a capable provider for my daughter. He wanted to show us that he had the capital and the liquidity to give Chloe the lifestyle she deserves. And quite frankly, after seeing your display tonight, I am glad he separated his finances from whatever chaotic arrangement you have going on." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The absolute delusion of this family was staggering. They were so eager to welcome a self-made millionaire into their ranks that they had not bothered to do a single background check. They had swallowed Trey's lies completely whole because he wore the right suits and smiled the right way. I turned my head and looked at my parents. Linda and Warren were standing just a few feet away, and they looked absolutely terrified. The defensive anger that had fueled my mother just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a stark, visceral panic. My father was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with me or with Chloe's family. They knew exactly what question I had just asked, and they knew exactly what the answer was. "Mom, Dad," I said, gesturing casually toward them. "Care to chime in on this beautiful narrative? Did your son pay for this lavish country club reception? Did his brilliant corporate career fund these imported orchids and the prime rib dinner?" My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Trey, her eyes wide with fear, and then she looked back at me, giving a tiny, desperate shake of her head. She was silently begging me to stop. She was pleading with me to protect the family secret, to uphold the grand illusion of the golden child, just as she had forced me to do for my entire life. But the days of me keeping their dirty secrets were officially over. Trey realized exactly where this was going. The financial facade was the absolute last thread keeping his marriage and his reputation intact. If that thread snapped, he would lose everything. The rich wife, the country club approval, the illusion of superiority. It would all be gone in an instant. The realization hit him with violent force. He completely lost his mind. Trey abandoned all pretense of being a refined, successful gentleman. He lunged forward wildly, rushing toward the DJ booth. He frantically waved his arms at the confused DJ, demanding he cut the microphone and start playing music. When the DJ just stood there frozen in shock, Trey spun around and began screaming at the top of his lungs. "Security!" Trey bellowed, his voice echoing frantically across the ballroom. "Get security in here right now. She is trespassing. She is a psychotic liar trying to ruin my wedding. Get her out of this building. Grab her and throw her out." He started marching toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He looked like he was ready to physically grab me by the arm and drag me out of the country club himself. My parents gasped, but neither of them moved to stop him. Chloe's father took a hesitant step back, shocked by the sudden aggressive outburst from his perfectly polished son-in-law. But Trey did not even make it 3 steps. Before my brother could even get close to my table, Elijah moved. The billionaire CEO did not yell and he did not rush. He simply stepped forward with an effortless, fluid motion, placing himself directly between me and my frantic brother. It was a subtle shift in positioning, but the physical contrast between the two men was devastating. Trey was sweating manic and unraveling at the seams. Elijah was a solid, immovable wall of calm, absolute authority. Elijah did not raise his voice, but the cold, lethal command in his tone stopped Trey dead in his tracks. "I strongly suggest you lower your voice and step back, Trey," Elijah said, his eyes locking onto my brother with terrifying intensity. Trey froze, his chest heaving as he stared up at the man who held his entire career in his hands. The unspoken threat in Elijah's voice was crystal clear. One more step, one more raised voice, and the professional consequences would be catastrophic. Trey visibly shrank under the heavy, intimidating gaze of the executive. He took a stumbling step backward, his hands shaking violently at his sides. I was completely rendered powerless, trapped between the billionaire he was desperate to impress and the sister he had spent his life trying to destroy. Chloe began to cry. The perfect, beautiful bride was sobbing, standing in the middle of her ruined reception, looking frantically between her father and her new husband. "What is going on?" Chloe cried out, her voice trembling with confusion and fear. Daddy, what is happening? Trey, what is she talking about?" I stood in the center of the absolute chaos I had orchestrated. The room was watching me, waiting with bated breath for the final shoe to drop. My friends Keisha and Jasmine stood faithfully by my side, their designer gowns serving as a brilliant contrast to the dark, shadowy corner my family had tried to banish me to. I had endured decades of being the scapegoat. I had survived having my college funds stolen, my ambitions mocked, and my living situation ridiculed. I had sat quietly while my brother paraded around as a self-made success story built entirely on my stolen future. I looked at my brother, who was now staring at me with pure, unadulterated terror. I looked at my parents, who were bracing themselves for the impact of the truth. I reached my hand into the soft, expensive leather of my evening clutch. My fingers brushed past my lipstick, and my phone grasping the thick stack of folded paper I had carried with me all evening. I pulled my hand out of the bag, bringing the documents into the light for everyone to see. The thick stack of heavy bond paper felt solid and reassuring in my hands. I unfolded the document, smoothing out the creases with deliberate care. The crisp sound of the thick paper cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom. I stepped around my small table, moving past Elijah, who smoothly shifted his weight to ensure my path was completely clear while keeping Trey securely boxed in on the dance floor. I walked directly up to Chloe's father. I did not hand the papers to Trey. I placed them squarely on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the father's half-empty crystal wine glass. Take a look at the first page. I instructed, my voice calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. Those are certified financial disclosures from the very bank where Trey supposedly holds his massive executive accounts. You might want to pay special attention to the summary on page 2. Chloe's father hesitated for a fraction of a second, his wealthy arrogance battling with his desperate need to know the truth. He snatched the papers off the table. He adjusted his reading glasses, his pale eyes scanning the black ink. Chloe stepped up behind him, peering over his shoulder to look at the documents. Her perfect bridal makeup could not hide the sheer panic washing over her features. She looked at the red negative numbers printed on the official bank letterhead and let out a small, horrified gasp. "Allow me to summarize for the rest of the room," I announced, turning my body so I could address the entire crowd. The self-made man standing before you, the corporate genius who just claimed to have paid for this entire lavish reception, is completely and utterly broke. In fact, broke would be a massive step up for him. Trey is drowning in over $200,000 of high-interest consumer debt. Trey let out a strangled gasp. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She forged those. She printed them off the internet." I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes on Chloe's father, who was currently turning the pages with trembling hands. "He has 3 maxed-out credit cards and collections." I continued, my voice ringing clear and steady. "Look at the business accounts. Trey told you he was a visionary. The truth is, he launched 3 different tech applications over the last 10 years. Every single one of them crashed before they even hit the market. He burned through investor capital, he burned through personal loans, and he burned through every favor he could beg or borrow. He has never generated a single dollar of actual profit in his entire miserable life. He is currently 4 months behind on the lease payments for that luxury sports car he drove up here in. He possesses absolutely no liquid assets. His net worth is severely in the negative. He is functionally bankrupt." The ballroom erupted into a symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispering. The wealthy guests, who had been swooning over Trey all evening, were now staring at him like he was carrying a highly contagious disease. Chloe's father looked up from the bank statements. The arrogant superiority that had defined his entire personality was completely gone. His face had turned a dangerous mottled shade of deep red. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling as the reality of his massive miscalculation hit him. "If he is bankrupt!" Chloe's father growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "How did he pay for his half of this wedding?" The venue deposit alone was $75,000. The catering was another $50,000. Where did that money come from? I smiled a slow, tragic smile. I turned my head slowly, shifting my gaze away from the furious father of the bride and locking my eyes directly onto my parents. They had spent the last 2 months harassing me about my modest lifestyle. They had demanded I show proper gratitude for being invited to this lavish affair. They had scolded me for wearing a simple dress, telling me I needed to look presentable for Chloe's high society family. All the while they were hiding a secret so toxic it was about to destroy their entire lives. Linda and Warren were standing frozen near the edge of the dance floor. They looked like 2 people who had just been convicted of a capital crime. My mother's hands were shaking so violently that her sequined evening bag slipped from her grasp and hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. She did not even try to pick it up. My father was staring at the floor, his broad shoulders completely slumped. all his arrogant bluster entirely evaporated. "That is the most interesting part of the story," I said, stepping toward my parents. "The grand betrayal. You see, Trey did not pay for a single flower, a single appetizer, or a single drop of champagne tonight. My parents paid for it." Chloe's father scoffed, slamming the papers down on the table. "So what? They are his parents. They helped him out. That does not make it a crime." "It is not a crime," I agreed, my voice dropping to a sharp, dangerous register. "But it is a profound tragedy when you look at how they got the money." I reached across the table and flipped to the fourth page of the document stack. I tapped my finger against a highly classified certified bank transfer record. "My parents are not wealthy people," I explained to the silent ballroom. "They worked middle-class jobs their entire lives. But they did have one single significant asset. They owned our childhood home free and clear. They spent 30 years paying off that mortgage. It was their sanctuary, their safety net, and their entire retirement plan." But Trey needed a country club wedding. Trey needed to impress a family of millionaires to secure his meal ticket. So he did what he always does. He manipulated his parents into sacrificing their own survival to feed his fragile ego. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was now streaming with silent, terrified tears. She let out a loud, tragic wail, covering her face with her hands, unable to look at the disgusted expressions of the wealthy people she had tried so desperately to impress. 30 days ago, my parents secretly took out a massive high-interest second mortgage on their fully paid-off home. I announced, my words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. They leveraged their entire property, pulling out $150,000 in cash. They handed every single penny of their life savings over to Trey, just so he could stand in this room and pretend to be a corporate titan. They wiped out their entire future just to buy him this one night of fake glory. They signed away the roof over their own heads, because Trey convinced them that once he married into your rich family, he would be set for life and could easily pay them back. It was a calculated, predatory investment, and your family was the target. The collective shock in the room was absolute. This was not just a story of a broke groom lying about his bank account. This was a story of a man so deeply narcissistic and devoid of empathy that he would actively drive his own elderly parents into severe financial ruin just to keep up appearances. Chloe's father snatched the fourth page off the table. He stared at the loan origination documents, staring at the undeniable signatures of Linda and Warren, authenticating the massive, terrible debt they had willingly taken on. My father, Warren, finally broke. The sheer crushing weight of his public exposure shattered him completely. He dropped his face into his hands, letting out a harsh, ragged sob that echoed painfully across the dance floor. He had spent his entire life trying to project an image of strength and success, and now hundreds of elite guests were watching him weep over his absolute financial destruction. "You fools!" Chloe's father roared, his voice booming with terrifying rage as he looked at my parents. "You absolute pathetic fools. You mortgaged your own home to trick my family. You financed a lie so this worthless fraud could marry my daughter and get access to her trust fund." He spun around and glared at Trey, his eyes wide with pure, unfiltered hatred. Trey was physically trembling, trapped behind the immovable wall of Elijah's presence. The golden child was finally completely exposed. There were no more lies left to spin. There were no more parents left to drain. He was a fraud, a failure, and a financial black hole, and the wealthy family he had tried so desperately to con had just discovered the absolute devastating truth. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom did not last another second. The heavy, crushing weight of the truth finally broke the fragile illusion of the evening, and the entire wedding reception descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Chloe let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She dropped her bridal bouquet, letting the expensive imported white orchids scatter across the polished hardwood floor. She lunged at my brother, her hands balled into tight fists. She slammed her hands against Trey's chest, hitting the lapels of his rented tuxedo. "You lied to me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the high ceilings. "You told me you were a millionaire. You told me you owned properties. You told me you were going to take care of me." Trey stumbled backward, trying to catch her wrists, trying to shush her in front of the staring crowd. "Chloe, please," he begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I can explain everything. It is just a temporary cash flow problem. The promotion at the new firm was going to fix all of it. I just needed a little bit of time to get my accounts in order. You do not even have an account! Chloe screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect bridal makeup. You do not have anything. You let my parents pay for the honeymoon. You let my father buy us that house in the suburbs because you said your capital was tied up in corporate investments. You are completely broke. Chloe's father had heard more than enough. He stepped forward, his face a mask of pure aristocratic fury. He grabbed his daughter by the arm, pulling her away from the pathetic, sweating man she had just legally bound herself to. A temporary cash flow problem, Chloe's father roared. You do not have a cash flow problem, you parasite. You have absolutely no cash at all. You targeted my daughter. You researched our family, and you targeted her trust fund, because you are a miserable broke failure who needed a wealthy bank account to leech off of. Trey held his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. That is not true, he pleaded, looking frantically between Chloe and her furious father. I love her. The money does not matter to me. I swear I love her. Do not you dare speak to her, Chloe's father bellowed, stepping aggressively toward my brother. You sat in my study drinking my scotch, telling me about your massive stock portfolios. You sat at my dinner table and promised me you could provide for my daughter. You are nothing but a common street con artist in a cheap rented suit. I will have this marriage annulled before the sun comes up tomorrow. I will make sure you never step foot near my daughter or my family ever again. The wealthy guests were now actively standing up from their tables, pointing and whispering loudly. The elite society friends that my parents had been so desperate to impress were now looking at them with blatant, undisguised disgust. Some of the guests were already walking toward the coat check, eager to escape the humiliating spectacle. The wedding photographer had awkwardly lowered his camera, unsure of what to do, while the DJ was silently unplugging his sound equipment, clearly wanting no part of this disaster. The reality of this massive public exposure was simply too much for my parents to bear. They had spent their entire adult lives cultivating an image of a proud, successful family. They had demanded respect and obedience from me while pouring all their resources into their useless son. Now every single person in the room knew that they were gullible, financially ruined fools who had mortgaged their own survival for a fake Rolex and a country club party. My mother, Linda, suddenly turned on Trey. The unconditional maternal support she had shown him just 5 minutes ago vanished the moment she realized her own social standing was completely destroyed. She marched up to him, her face twisted in anger and fear. You told us this was a sure thing, Linda yelled, hitting him on the shoulder. You promised us that once you married Chloe, her father was going to make you a vice president at his dealership group. You said you would pay us back the $150,000 the second you got back from the honeymoon. You swore to us, Trey. Trey backed away from her, his eyes wide and wild. He was entirely cornered, and like a cornered animal, he lashed out at the very people who had protected him. You offered me the money, Trey shouted back, his voice defensive and shrill. You are the ones who wanted this fancy country club wedding just as much as I did. You wanted to sit at the head table and drink expensive champagne with rich people. Do not stand here and act like you are innocent victims. You handed over the deed to the house because you wanted to show off. Linda gasped, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically stabbed. She looked around at the staring guests, her face burning with profound shame as her own son threw her under the bus in front of high society. She had sacrificed her daughter, her savings, and her dignity to protect him, and he had turned on her the second things got difficult. My father, Warren, could not take it anymore. He fell to his knees on the edge of the dance floor. He gripped his thinning hair, his broad shoulders shaking violently as a deep, agonizing sob tore out of his throat. He looked at the furious faces of Chloe's parents and the disgusted expressions of the country club elite. We have nothing left. Warren wept, the absolute despair completely taking over his voice. We gave him everything. We gave him the house. We gave him the retirement accounts. We are completely ruined. Linda rushed to his side, dropping to her knees next to him. Warren, get up! She hissed, her voice frantic as she tried to pull him back to his feet. People are watching us. Warren, please get up. Do not embarrass us any further. But my father could not get up. The crushing realization of his terrible financial decisions had physically broken him. He was a man in his late 60s, facing the absolute terrifying certainty of bankruptcy. He knew that the bank would come collecting soon. He knew that he had signed away the only asset he owned. He was staring down the barrel of homelessness, and he had absolutely no way out. Then a sudden shift occurred in my father's tear-filled eyes. Through his panic and his profound humiliation, he looked across the polished hardwood floor and saw me. I saw his daughter standing tall and completely unbothered, flanked by a billionaire chief executive officer and two incredibly powerful corporate lawyers. He remembered the massive $50 million number that Jasmine had just projected onto the screen. He remembered the pristine tailored silk dress I was wearing. He remembered that I owned an entire acquisitions firm. The gears in his desperate, panicked mind began to turn. The lifelong habit of expecting me to bear the burden of the family mistakes immediately kicked in. For 35 years, I had been the scapegoat, the one they blamed for their unhappiness, and the one they expected to quietly clean up their messes. My father did not see a successful, independent woman standing before him. He only saw a massive walking bank account that could instantly solve all of his problems. Warren scrambled up from the floor, stumbling awkwardly over his own feet as he rushed toward my table. Elijah immediately stepped forward to block his path, his broad shoulders forming a protective barrier, but I gently placed a hand on Elijah's arm, signaling him to stand down. I wanted my father to come closer. I wanted to hear exactly what he had to say. My father stopped just 2 feet away from me. His face was wet with tears, his breathing ragged and uneven. He reached his trembling hands out toward me, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate entitlement. "Iman," he begged, his voice cracking as he looked at me. "You have to help us. You are rich. You have $50 million. You own a massive company. You can fix this. You have to write a check and pay off the mortgage right now." I looked at him, my expression perfectly blank. I did not say a word, allowing his desperate demands to fill the silent space between us. "Please, Iman," Warren pleaded, stepping even closer. "You cannot let us lose the house. We will be out on the street. We do not have a single dime left in our retirement accounts. You have more money than you could ever spend. Paying off $150,000 is nothing to you. You can save us. We are your family." The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He had watched my brother mock my living situation. He had demanded I apologize to a woman who had insulted me. He had stood by while they laughed at my supposed failures. He had drained my college fund to pay for Trey's mistakes and allowed me to be evicted from my dorm room when I was just 19 years old. He had never once asked if I was okay, if I had enough to eat, or if I needed help building my life. And now, after treating me like garbage for decades, he stood before me demanding that I rescue him from the exact financial ruin he had willingly walked into. He expected me to act like the dutiful, obedient daughter and hand over a fortune to cover the cost of a fake wedding for a son who despised me. I looked at my weeping father. I looked at my mother, who was now staring at me with the exact same desperate, greedy hope in her eyes. I looked at Trey, who was silently praying that I would bail him out one last time. I smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who was about to drop the final devastating curtain on their entire pathetic existence. My father stood before me with his hands outstretched, his face shining with tears and sweat. He was waiting for me to pull out a checkbook. I was waiting for the obedient little girl he had spent decades conditioning to silently absorb his burdens, to nod her head and fix his massive mistakes. He truly believed that the concept of family was a one-way street where he could extract my resources whenever he needed them, without ever offering protection in return. I looked at his trembling hands. I looked at my mother, who was watching me with wide, desperate eyes, holding her breath. I looked at Trey, who was cowering behind them, secretly praying that my financial success would become his ultimate safety net. I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between my father and me. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with an absolute chilling finality that made him flinch. "You want me to pay off your mortgage?" I asked, my tone dangerously soft. "You want me to hand over $150,000 to clean up the mess you made?" "Yes, Iman," my father pleaded, nodding eagerly. "You have the money. It is nothing to you. We are your family. We need you." I let out a short, bitter laugh. Family. Is that what we are calling it tonight? Where was this profound sense of family an hour ago, when your son was standing on a stage publicly mocking my living situation? Where was this family loyalty when Chloe and her father were belittling me and treating me like garbage? You sat at the head table and laughed at me. You marched over to my corner and demanded I apologize for breathing the same air as your wealthy guests. You did not act like my family then. You acted like my wardens keeping me in line so your golden boy could shine. My mother took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. We were just caught up in the moment, Iman. We did not know you were successful, if we had known. If you had known I would be useful to you, then you would have treated me with basic human decency, I finished for her. That is exactly the point, Linda. You only respect power and money. You do not respect me. You never have. I turned my attention back to my father, who was now staring at me with a mixture of fear and rising desperation. 16 years ago, I stood in your kitchen and begged you for help. I reminded him, my voice steady and unwavering. I was 19 years old. I had just found out that my college savings account, the money I scrubbed diner floors to earn, had been completely wiped out. I cried. I begged you to tell me it was a mistake. And do you remember what you told me, Warren? Do you remember the exact words you used when you allowed me to be evicted from my college dorm? My father swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. He remembered. You told me that family sacrifices for family, I quoted, throwing his own toxic logic right back in his face. You told me that Trey needed the money more than I did because he had real ambition. You told me I was being selfish for wanting an education when my brother was trying to build a business. You demanded that I sacrifice my future so you could bail him out of his gambling debts. I took a deep breath, letting the heavy silence of the ballroom amplify my words. Well, Dad, I said smoothly, I am finally taking your advice. Family sacrifices for family. So tonight you and Linda are going to sacrifice your retirement, your home, and your financial stability to pay for Trey's fake wedding. It is a beautiful full-circle moment, do not you think? My father let out a choked gasp, his knees buckling slightly as the reality of my absolute rejection washed over him. He realized I was not going to save him. The massive walking bank account he had tried to claim was firmly, securely locked. My mother started to sob loudly, burying her face in her hands. Trey, however, could not accept it. The realization that he was completely cut off, that his final life raft had just sailed away, ignited a sudden desperate fury in him. He pushed past my parents, his face red and contorted with anger. You greedy, selfish woman, Trey shouted, pointing a finger at me. You have $50 million. You could write a check right now and make all of this go away. But you are so bitter and vindictive that you would rather watch your own parents lose their house. You owe us. I did not flinch. I simply turned to Keisha, who was standing calmly by my side. She was already holding a sleek black leather folder. She opened it and retrieved a single piece of heavy, crisp paper. She handed it to me with a brilliant, predatory smile. I took the paper and stepped directly up to Trey. I did not hand it to my father. I shoved it squarely against Trey's chest, forcing him to take it. I do not owe you anything, Trey, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. But you certainly owe me. Trey looked down at the document in his hands. It was not a bank statement. It was a formal, legally binding invoice generated by my acquisitions firm's accounting department. It was printed on heavy corporate letterhead, complete with our company seal. What is this? Trey demanded, his eyes scanning the numbers. That is an itemized invoice, I explained loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. 16 years ago, you stole exactly $30,000 from my bank account. You took my future to fund your pathetic failures. Now, as a woman who buys and sells companies for a living, I do not believe in forgiving corporate theft. I believe in collecting debts with interest. Keisha stepped forward, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandeliers. She adjusted her posture, slipping seamlessly into her role as Chief Financial Officer. At a standard market return rate of 8% compounded annually over a period of 16 years. 16 years, Keisha announced, her voice ringing with absolute authority. That initial $30,000 theft has matured significantly. Factoring in inflation and the standard corporate penalties for unauthorized withdrawal of funds, your total outstanding balance is exactly $103,687. Trey stared at the invoice, his hands shaking violently. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. He was already drowning in consumer debt. His new father-in-law had just exposed him as a fraud and threatened an annulment. His job was completely in jeopardy. And now his younger sister had just handed him a massive six-figure bill in front of high society. "You are insane," Trey stammered, backing away from me. "You cannot legally enforce this. You cannot charge me interest on a family issue." "I am not charging you as your sister," I replied smoothly. "I am billing you as a creditor. You see, Trey, the world of high finance, the world you tried so desperately to pretend you belong to, operates on very simple rules. You take capital, you pay for the capital. You took my money. Now you are getting the bill." I stepped closer to him, forcing him to look me in the eye. "You do not get bailouts anymore, Trey." I said, my words hitting him like physical blows. "You do not get to drain our parents dry and then demand I fix the damage. Your free ride is officially over. You get bills now. And if you do not pay this invoice within 30 days, my legal team will aggressively garnish whatever pathetic wages you manage to earn for the rest of your miserable life." Trey was hyperventilating. He crumpled the invoice in his fist, looking wildly around the room for anyone to defend him. But there was no one left. Chloe and her family were looking at him with pure disgust. The wealthy guests were shaking their heads in judgment. Elijah stood silently watching his new hire completely self-destruct. The absolute finality of my rejection broke whatever fragile hope my father had left. Warren realized that Trey was a sinking ship and that I was not going to throw either of them a life preserver. The panic that had been simmering just below the surface of his demeanor suddenly boiled over into sheer, terrifying hysteria. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a desperate, frantic grip. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his face completely devoid of color. Man, you do not understand," Warren screamed, his voice echoing frantically across the ballroom. "You have to help us. You have to write the check today. We do not have time. The loan we took out was predatory. We missed the hidden clauses. If you do not give us the money right now, the bank is foreclosing on our house on Monday morning." He tightened his grip, shaking my arm as tears streamed down his face. "Monday, man," he wept, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. "They are going to lock us out. We will be on the street. We will have absolutely nothing. You cannot let them take our home." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply looked at him, allowing the sheer terror of his situation to fully manifest in the room. He was begging for his survival. He was terrified of losing the roof over his head. The hook was set perfectly, and it was finally time to deliver the ultimate checkmate. I looked down at my father's hand gripping my bare arm. His fingers were digging into my skin, leaving pale crescent moons where his nails pressed down. He was shaking so violently that the tremor traveled up my arm and into my shoulder. He was a broken man, stripped of all his arrogant patriarchal authority, begging his scapegoat daughter for a miracle. I did not shove him away. I simply reached up and wrapped my own hand around his wrist. I pried his fingers off my arm with slow, deliberate strength, moving his hand away as if I were removing a piece of trash from my expensive silk dress. Warren stumbled back a step, his chest heaving. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, waiting for me to say the words he had conditioned me to say my entire life. He expected me to tell him everything would be okay. He expected me to write a check and save his pristine suburban image. He thought that because we shared the same blood, I would simply absorb his catastrophic failures and let him walk away completely unscarred. I smoothed the fabric of my sleeve where he had grabbed me. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring the wealthy guests standing around us could hear every single syllable of his financial ruin. Chloe's father was standing just a few feet away, watching the exchange with a mixture of horror and profound fascination. I was witnessing a masterclass in corporate execution, and he knew it. "You really should have read the fine print on that second mortgage, Dad," I said smoothly, my tone echoing through the silent country club ballroom. "You were so desperate to hand Trey $150,000 in cash that you bypassed traditional banking and went straight to a shadow lender. You took out a predatory high-interest loan against a property you had already spent 30 years paying off. Did you honestly think a shadow lender was going to sit around and wait for you to catch up on your missed payments?" My father opened his mouth to speak, but he was breathing too heavily to form a coherent sentence. He just shook his head, tears continuing to stream down his deeply lined face. Banks and private lenders do not like to hold on to toxic assets, I explained, pacing slowly in front of him. When a debtor proves they have absolutely no liquid capital and no means of generating income, the lender will quickly offload the debt to mitigate their own risk. They bundle up bad mortgages and sell them for pennies on the dollar to private acquisitions firms, firms that specialize in hostile takeovers and aggressive asset liquidation. My mother, Linda, let out a small, terrified whimper. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror. She did not fully understand corporate finance, but she understood the cold, lethal tone of my voice. The house was her entire identity. It was a sprawling brick colonial in a gated community that she used to lord her status over the rest of our extended family. It was the house where she had hosted fancy dinner parties, where she had bragged about Trey's fake promotions, and where she had told me I was an embarrassment. The thought of losing that house was a fate worse than death for a woman obsessed with high society appearances. You have been screaming that the bank is coming to lock the doors on Monday morning. I continued, stopping directly in front of my father. You are terrified of the foreclosure notice. You are standing here begging me to save you from the collection agents. But you are panicking over outdated information, Warren. My father blinked, his tear-filled eyes widening with a sudden pathetic spark of hope. What do you mean? He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Are they giving us an extension? Did you call them Iman? Did you fix the loan? I smiled. It was the coldest, most ruthless smile I had ever worn in my entire life. It was the culmination of a decade of silent, grueling preparation, of swallowing insults and working 18-hour days while they celebrated my brother's mediocre existence. It was the smile of a woman who had finally transformed her profound generational trauma into an impenetrable fortress of wealth and power. They are not foreclosing on Monday. Dad, I announced, my voice ringing across the silent ballroom, carrying an absolute chilling finality. The bank does not own your distressed debt anymore. They sold the paper 48 hours ago to a private acquisitions firm. The tiny spark of hope in my father's eyes instantly extinguished, replaced by utter confusion. He looked at my mother, who was trembling so hard her beaded evening gown was shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. Trey let out a low, panicked moan, realizing that a private firm would be infinitely more ruthless than a traditional bank. A private firm would show absolutely no mercy. I reached my hand out to the side without breaking eye contact with my father. Jasmine stepped forward, her crimson designer dress flowing beautifully as she moved to stand right beside me. She had been holding onto a sleek leather portfolio all evening, waiting patiently for the absolute perfect moment to deliver the killing blow. As my chief legal counsel, she had personally overseen every single detail of this transaction, ensuring that my family had absolutely no legal loopholes to escape through. Jasmine opened the folder and retrieved a thick, notarized document. She handed it to me with a brilliant, predatory smile. I took the document and held it up under the bright lights of the grand ballroom, ensuring the harsh illumination caught the official state stamps and the unmistakable watermark of my corporate empire. My firm, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper that sent a visible shiver down my brother's spine. My firm bought your distressed debt. I bought your house yesterday. The realization hit Linda, Warren, and Trey like a runaway freight train. The physical reaction to my words was immediate and utterly devastating. My mother, Linda, let out a piercing, agonized shriek and physically collapsed. Her knees gave out completely, and she crumpled heavily into a nearby dining chair, burying her face in her hands as she wailed loudly in front of the entire country club. The pristine suburban castle she had used to define her superiority was entirely gone. My father, Warren, staggered backward, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the official deed transfer in my hands. He brought a shaking hand up to his chest, looking like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He had signed away his sanctuary to fund a lie, and now the daughter he had discarded held the keys to his front door. Trey backed away until his shoulders hit the edge of a decorated table, knocking over a tall glass centerpiece that shattered into 100 pieces on the hardwood floor. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. He realized he had no safety net left. He had no childhood home to retreat to when Chloe inevitably kicked him out of her life. He was stranded on an island of his own making, and the water was rising fast. Chloe's wealthy parents watched the scene unfold in stunned, absolute silence. They were bearing witness to the complete and total dismantling of the fraudulent family that had almost conned their way into their bloodline. My biological family did not own their home anymore. They did not own the roof over their heads. They did not own the walls that had sheltered them while they threw me out into the cold 16 years ago. They were entirely at my mercy, and they knew I had none left to give. I lowered the document, holding it casually at my side as I looked at the three shattered people standing before me. I owned their home. I owned their debt. I owned their entire existence. The ballroom remained trapped in a state of absolute suspended animation. My father Warren was staring at the certified deed in my hand as if it were a physical weapon pointed directly at his chest. The pristine suburban house, the ultimate symbol of his fabricated success, was no longer his. I watched his eyes dart back and forth, processing the fact that the very daughter he had discarded now held absolute authority over his basic survival. My mother, Linda, was still weeping into her hands, her expensive beaded gown rustling with every ragged breath she took. Trey was leaning against the table he had crashed into, looking like a hollow, empty shell of a man. I slowly lowered the document and handed it back to Jasmine, who tucked it neatly into her leather portfolio. I took a step closer to my parents, ensuring my voice would carry clearly to them and to the wealthy guests who were still watching this spectacular downfall. Let me make this very clear. I said, my tone perfectly even and devoid of any lingering familial warmth. You do not own that house anymore. The bank washed their hands of your massive financial mistakes and transferred the deed to my acquisitions firm. That means I am officially your landlord. Warren opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but no words came out. Linda lifted her tear-stained face, looking at me with a pathetic, desperate hope. Amen, please, Linda begged, her voice cracking under the weight of her humiliation. You cannot do this to us. We raised you. We are your mother and father. You can just cancel the debt. You can just let us live in our home. We promise we will make it up to you. I shook my head slowly, letting a cold, satisfied smile touch my lips. You are not getting a free ride, Linda. You spent my entire life teaching me that family sacrifices for family, and that nothing in this world is free. I am simply applying your own harsh lessons to this new arrangement. You are going to stay in that house, but you are going to pay for it. I paced slowly in front of them, laying out the new reality of their miserable existence. Starting on the 1st of next month, you will pay me market rate rent for the privilege of living in my property, I announced. My legal team will be sending you a formal residential lease agreement tomorrow morning. You will pay the rent on time every single month. There will be no grace periods. There will be no family discounts. There will be no extensions because someone had a bad week or because Trey needed to borrow your grocery money. If you miss a single payment by even one day, I will personally file the eviction notice and have the sheriff remove your belongings to the curb. My father let out a low, agonizing groan. He knew they had completely wiped out their retirement accounts. He knew they had absolutely no steady income to cover a market-rate rent on a sprawling suburban colonial house. They were going to have to find minimum wage jobs in their late 60s just to keep a roof over their heads. And as for you, Trey, I said, turning my attention to my sweating, panicked brother, you are not allowed to live in that house rent-free anymore. If you want to sleep in your old childhood bedroom, you will pay your portion of the rent directly to my firm. You are going to have to get a job and actually work for a living. The mention of a job seemed to snap Trey out of his temporary paralysis. He suddenly remembered that he still had a prestigious director-level position at a massive corporate firm. He clung to that single remaining shred of dignity like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. I have a job. Trey spat out, his voice shaking, but laced with a desperate defensive anger. I am a director of regional acquisitions. I make a 6-figure salary. I can easily afford to pay rent, and I can afford to take care of my parents. You think you have destroyed me, Iman, but you have not. I am still an executive. Before I could even respond to his pathetic delusion, Elijah stepped forward. The billionaire chief executive officer moved with a slow, deliberate grace, placing himself right next to me. the warm, supportive friend who had hugged me earlier was completely gone. In his place stood the ruthless corporate titan who managed billions of dollars and tolerated absolutely no incompetence. Elijah looked at Trey with a gaze so cold and piercing it could have frozen water. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his posture as he looked down at my trembling brother. "You really are incredibly stupid," Trey Elijah said, his deep voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Did you honestly think a top-tier corporate acquisitions firm would just hand you a director position without running a comprehensive background check?" Trey swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously. He took a tiny step backward away from his boss. "When you submitted your application to Human Resources," Elijah continued, his tone clinical and punishing, "you signed a legally binding financial disclosure form. You certified under penalty of perjury that you were not carrying any massive undeclared debts and that you were not engaged in any active financial fraud. You claimed to be a financially responsible executive capable of handling sensitive corporate mergers." Elijah gestured toward the bank statements I had left on the table. "We now have documented public proof that you are drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of consumer debt. We have proof that you coerced your elderly parents into a predatory loan to fund a fake lifestyle. You are a walking financial liability, Trey. A firm that specializes in corporate acquisitions cannot and will not employ a man who is engaged in active personal fraud." Trey began to shake his hands, raised in a desperate pleading gesture. "Elijah, please," he begged, completely abandoning his arrogant facade. "Boss, I can explain. It is just a temporary setback. I am a hard worker. I can bring value to the company. Please do not do this to me." Elijah did not show a single ounce of mercy. He looked at Trey with pure, unfiltered disgust. "I am not your boss anymore," Elijah announced, his voice carrying the heavy, lethal weight of absolute finality. "You lied on your corporate disclosures. You manipulated your family. You are a massive liability to our shareholders. You are officially terminated from your position, effective immediately. Human Resources will email your formal separation paperwork on Monday morning. Do not ever step foot on my corporate campus again." The ballroom remained dead silent as the final pillar of Trey's entire fake existence violently collapsed. He did not have a job. He did not have a six-figure salary. He was a broke, unemployed fraud who now owed his younger sister a massive monthly rent payment just to avoid sleeping on the street. The golden child had been completely stripped of his gold, leaving nothing but a pathetic, desperate man standing in a rented tuxedo. Trey realized that his entire life was completely gone. The prestigious job, the wealthy illusion, the supportive parents who could bail him out had all vanished in an instant. He had lost every single thing that gave him power. The only thing he had left in the entire world was the wealthy, beautiful bride standing just a few feet away from him. He knew that Chloe and her massive family trust fund were his absolute last chance at survival. Trey spun around and looked at Chloe. The beautiful bride was standing next to her furious father, her face stained with dark mascara, tears running down her cheeks. She was looking at the man she had just married with a mixture of profound horror and absolute disgust. Trey let out a desperate, ragged sob. He took a stumbling step toward her, his hands outstretched. He did not care about his pride anymore. He did not care about looking like a strong, successful man in front of the wealthy country club guests. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the polished hardwood dance floor. "Chloe, please," Trey wept, looking up at her from the floor. "Please do not leave me. I did all of this for you. I just wanted to give you the perfect wedding. I wanted your family to accept me. I can fix this. I swear I can fix this. We are husband and wife. You have to stay with me." He reached out, trying to grab the heavy silk fabric of her designer wedding gown. Chloe violently yanked her dress away from his grasping hands, as if his very touch would infect her with his miserable failure. Chloe looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor. She saw the absolute ruin of her perfect high society wedding. She saw the wealthy guests whispering and pointing at her monumental mistake. She realized that she had been completely played by a broke, unemployed con artist who had driven his own family into bankruptcy just to buy her a fancy dinner. The sheer humiliation of the moment finally broke through her shock. Chloe let out a furious, agonizing scream. She reached down and grabbed her left hand. With a violent jerky motion, she yanked the heavy, expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger. It was a ring that Trey had undoubtedly purchased on a maxed-out credit card he could never repay. Chloe did not hand the ring back to him gently. She drew her arm back and threw the heavy diamond directly at his face with all the furious strength she possessed. The cool night air outside the country club felt like the first real breath I had taken in 35 years. Walking away from that ballroom was not just an exit. It was an absolute severing of the heavy, suffocating chains I had dragged behind me my entire life. I did not look back at the grand building. I did not check my phone when it began vibrating relentlessly with frantic messages and missed calls from the people I had just left behind. I simply got into the waiting car with the people who actually valued me and let the driver pull away from the wreckage. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. When you build an entire existence on a foundation of lies, gravity always wins in the end. Chloe and her wealthy family moved with the ruthless efficiency of the ultra-rich protecting their assets. She filed for an annulment less than 48 hours after the wedding reception. She did not even give Trey the dignity of a face-to-face conversation. Her father's corporate lawyers simply showed up and handed my brother a stack of heavily binding legal papers, completely erasing his brief, miserable stint in high society. Trey had absolutely nowhere to run. Elijah stayed true to his word. Human Resources terminated Trey's employment first thing Monday morning, citing his fraudulent financial disclosures. Without a six-figure salary to pretend he was successful, and without a wealthy bride to leech off of his fake lifestyle violently imploded, his luxury sports car was repossessed by the end of the week. I was forced to pack his few remaining possessions into garbage bags and retreat to the only place that would take him in. He moved back into the house I now owned. But my property management team made it exceptionally clear that the master bedrooms were not included in his lease agreement. The golden child, the man who had stood on a stage and mocked my living situation, was forced to drag his garbage bags down into the unfinished basement. He now sleeps on a cheap mattress surrounded by concrete walls, listening to the footsteps of the parents he actively drove into bankruptcy. I hear from the property manager that he still tries to wear his custom suits, but they are wrinkled and smell like damp cement. He has no money to dry clean them, and nowhere important to wear them anyway. As for my parents, Linda and Warren, their reality check was a spectacular display of poetic justice. They quickly realized that my legal team was not making empty threats. When the first of the month rolled around, the market rate rent invoice arrived in their mailbox exactly as promised. With their retirement accounts completely drained and their home equity gone, they had absolutely no choice but to face the real world. My mother, who had spent her entire life judging working-class people and bragging about her suburban status, had to put on a stiff polyester uniform. She got a minimum wage job as a greeter at a local big-box retail store. She spends her days handing out shopping carts to the very same women she used to gossip with at the country club. They pretend not to recognize her, and the humiliation eats her alive every single shift. My father, who used to puff out his chest and pretend to be a titan of traditional family values, took a job bagging groceries at a supermarket just 3 miles away from his old neighborhood. His back constantly aches from standing on the hard linoleum floors. They spend 40 hours a week dealing with rude customers and counting every single penny, just so they can transfer their paychecks directly into my corporate holding account. They are paying me for the privilege of sleeping in a house they used to own free and clear. They tried calling me a few times begging for a reduction in rent, but my assistant automatically routes their numbers to a voicemail box I never check. I do not feel sorry for them. I do not lose a single ounce of sleep over their situation. They are simply experiencing the natural consequences of the choices they made every single day for decades. They chose to steal my college fund. They chose to enable a narcissist. They chose to try and humiliate me for their own amusement. I did not ruin their lives. I just stopped shielding them from the reality of their own actions. Tonight, the air is warm, and the city lights are stretching out below me like a blanket of glittering diamonds. I am sitting on the expansive terrace of my $50 million penthouse. The glass edge of the infinity pool is catching the reflection of the skyline, and soft jazz music is playing from the outdoor speakers. I am holding a glass of vintage wine, but I am not hiding in a dark corner near the kitchen doors. I am sitting at the very top of the world. Keisha is lounging on a plush outdoor sofa, laughing loudly at a joke Jasmine just made. Jasmine is leaning against the glass railing, holding a crystal flute and looking out at the city we practically own. Elijah is sitting next to me. His jacket discarded, his tie loosened, looking completely relaxed and at peace. We are not bound by blood, but the loyalty at this table runs deeper than any genetic tie ever could. They are my board of directors, my business partners, and my truest friends. They are the people who watched me build my empire from the absolute bottom. They held me up when I was exhausted. They celebrated my victories when my biological family ignored them, and they stood like an impenetrable wall between me and the people who tried to tear me down. They are my chosen family. Looking at them, I realize how much time I wasted waiting for my parents to love me the way they loved Trey. I spent years twisting myself into knots, trying to be quiet, trying to be agreeable, trying to shrink myself down so I would not cast a shadow on my brother's fragile ego. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just responsible enough, they would finally see my value. I thought my accomplishments could eventually buy their affection. But you cannot force people to value you when they are committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot earn respect from people who require your subjugation to feel powerful. Family is not determined by the name on your birth certificate or the house you grew up in. Family is a verb. It is the consistent, active choice to show up for someone, to protect them, and to celebrate their light without feeling threatened by it. My biological family chose to view my light as a threat. They wanted me to be a failure because it made their own miserable choices easier to swallow. They needed a scapegoat to carry the weight of their financial incompetence and moral bankruptcy. But I refused to play the role they assigned to me. I refused to let their toxic narrative become my destiny. I broke the generational curse by simply walking away and taking my power with me. People often think that revenge requires malicious plotting or cruel deception. They think it requires you to become just as toxic as the people who hurt you. They imagine screaming matches and broken glass and years of bitter, exhausting conflict. But that is entirely untrue. The most devastating, the most absolute, and the sweetest revenge in the world requires absolutely no cruelty at all. The sweetest revenge is simply radical self-preservation. It is taking your energy, your resources, and your brilliant light entirely out of their reach. It is building a magnificent, beautiful life and refusing to let them have a single seat at your table. It is stepping out of their way and calmly, politely letting karma collect the massive debts they created all by themselves. I take a slow, satisfying sip of my wine, surrounded by the people who truly love me. My phone is silent, my future is entirely my own, and my brother finally got exactly what he paid for. The heavy doors of Elijah's private town car closed, shutting out the frantic screams echoing from the country club entrance. I sank into the plush leather seat and watched through the tinted glass as the chaotic scene faded into the distance. My phone screen lit up the dark interior of the car, vibrating relentlessly with a barrage of desperate text messages. Trey was begging for a second chance. My father was demanding I turn the car around. My mother was leaving frantic voicemails alternating between furious threats and pathetic sobbing. I did not listen to a single one. With a calm, steady motion, I selected their contact profiles and blocked every single number. The digital silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The fallout over the following weeks was a masterclass in the destructive power of the truth. When a life is built entirely on a fragile foundation of deception, gravity is a ruthless collector. Chloe and her high society family moved with the terrifying speed and efficiency of the ultra-wealthy, protecting their assets. The annulment paperwork was filed at the county courthouse before 9 on Monday morning. Chloe cited fraudulent financial inducement and gross misrepresentation, and she was absolutely correct on every count. Trey was served the legal documents. While attempting to retrieve his designer shoes from the luxury downtown apartment Chloe's father had temporarily rented for them. The building concierges who had previously greeted Trey with respectful nods watched in silent judgment as he was escorted off the premises, holding a single cardboard box of his belongings. His professional downfall was just as swift. Elijah did not hesitate to execute the termination. By 10 on Monday morning, the Human Resources Department at my acquisitions firm sent the official separation notice to Trey's personal email. Trey actually attempted to bypass the corporate security gates, hoping to ambush Elijah in the lobby and beg for his job. He swiped his temporary access badge against the scanner, but the light flashed a harsh, angry red. The security guards, the very same men Trey had arrogantly tried to boss around during his brief orientation week, physically blocked his path. They escorted the golden boy of my family off the manicured corporate campus, ensuring he never stepped foot on my property again. Without a six-figure salary to point to, and without a wealthy bride to leech off of, Trey's fabricated lifestyle violently imploded. His luxury sports car was aggressively repossessed by Wednesday afternoon, leaving him stranded on the side of the highway, completely out of options and entirely out of credit. Trey had no choice but to retreat to the only place that would accept him. He hauled 2 black garbage bags filled with wrinkled custom suits up the driveway of the sprawling brick colonial house I now owned. But my property management team had been explicitly instructed on the parameters of the lease. When Trey arrived, the property manager met him at the front door with a printed addendum. The master and guest bedrooms were strictly reserved for the paying tenants. Non-paying adult dependents were not granted access to the primary living quarters. Trey, the man who had stood on a stage and mocked my living situation, was directed to a heavy wooden door off the kitchen. He was forced to drag his garbage bags down the creaking stairs into the damp, unfinished basement. He now sleeps on a cheap, deflating air mattress positioned right next to a loud, rattling water heater. The golden child is living in a cold, concrete box, shivering in the dark, while listening to the heavy footsteps of the parents he actively drove into absolute bankruptcy. As for Linda and Warren, their reality check arrived exactly on the 1st of the month. Jasmine ensured the market rate rent invoice was delivered via certified mail. It was a massive, staggering number for a sprawling suburban property in a highly desirable neighborhood. With their retirement accounts completely drained to zero and the equity of their home entirely erased, my parents had absolutely no safety net. They were forced to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of the modern job market in their late 60s just to keep a roof over their heads. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life judging working-class people and bragging about her elite suburban status, had to trade her sequined gowns for a stiff, uncomfortable polyester vest. She secured a minimum wage job as a front-door greeter at a massive discount retail chain in the neighboring town. She spends her days standing on hard concrete floors, handing out sanitized shopping carts and forcing a polite smile. The true punishment comes on the weekends, when the wealthy women she used to gossip with at the country club walk through the sliding glass doors. Those elite women recognize Linda immediately. They look at her cheap uniform and her tired eyes, but they deliberately look away, pretending not to know her. The profound public humiliation eats my mother alive every single shift. My father took a job bagging groceries and collecting stray shopping carts in the parking lot of a local supermarket. A man who used to puff out his chest and demand respect, as the ultimate patriarch, now spends his afternoons apologizing to impatient customers for crushing their bread. His back aches constantly, and his pride is entirely shattered. Every single dollar they manage to scrape together from their grueling minimum wage jobs is transferred directly into my corporate holding account. They are working themselves to the bone, paying me for the privilege of sleeping in a house they used to own free and clear. They tried to send a letter to my corporate office begging for a temporary reduction in rent due to medical expenses. My assistant stamped it denied and filed it away without ever bringing it to my desk. I do not feel a single ounce of pity for them. I am simply holding them to the exact same harsh, unforgiving standards they held me to when I was a struggling 19-year-old girl. Tonight the air is warm, and the Atlanta city lights stretch out below me like a vast, glittering ocean of diamonds. I am sitting on the expansive private terrace of my $50 million triplex penthouse. The glass edge of the rooftop infinity pool catches the reflection of the illuminated skyline, and the soft, rhythmic beat of neo-soul music plays from the hidden outdoor speakers. I am holding a crystal glass of expensive vintage wine, but I am not hiding in a dark, drafty corner near the kitchen doors. I am sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the city. Keisha is lounging comfortably on a plush outdoor sofa, throwing her head back as she laughs loudly at a sharp, witty joke Jasmine just made. Jasmine is leaning against the thick glass balcony railing, holding her own glass, and looking out over the commercial real estate district we practically own. Elijah is sitting next to me, his tailored jacket discarded, and his collar loosened, looking completely relaxed and at peace in our shared space. We do not share the same bloodline, but the fierce, unwavering loyalty at this table runs infinitely deeper than any genetic tie ever could. They are my board of directors, my trusted business partners, and my truest friends. They are the people who watched me build my empire from the absolute bottom. They held me up when I was exhausted from working 18-hour days. They celebrated my quiet victories when my biological family ignored them. They stood like an impenetrable fortress wall between me and the people who tried to tear my confidence down. They are my chosen family. Looking at them smiling in the warm glow of the terrace lights, I realized just how much precious time I wasted waiting for my parents to love me the way they loved Trey. I spent decades twisting my personality into uncomfortable shapes, trying to be quiet, trying to be agreeable, trying to shrink my own ambition, so I would not cast an intimidating shadow on my brother's fragile ego. I foolishly believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just responsible and self-sufficient enough, they would finally recognize my value. I thought my accomplishments could eventually purchase their genuine affection. But the hardest lesson I ever learned is that you cannot force people to value you when they are deeply committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot earn respect from people who actively require your subjugation just to feel powerful in their own miserable lives. Family is not determined by the names printed on a birth certificate or the shared address of the house you grew up in. Family is an action. It is the consistent, active choice to show up for someone to protect their peace and to celebrate their brilliant light without ever feeling threatened by it. My biological family chose to view my light as a threat. They desperately needed me to be a failure because it made their own terrible choices easier to swallow. They required a convenient scapegoat to carry the heavy weight of their financial incompetence and moral bankruptcy. But I refused to play the tragic role they assigned to me. I refused to let their toxic, unyielding narrative become my destiny. I broke a massive generational curse by simply walking away and taking all of my power with me. People often think that getting revenge requires malicious plotting, angry screaming matches, or cruel deception. They imagine years of bitter, exhausting conflict that drains your soul. But that is completely untrue. The most devastating, the most absolute, and the sweetest revenge in the world requires absolutely no cruelty at all. The sweetest revenge is simply radical self-preservation. It is taking your energy, your vast resources, and your brilliant presence entirely out of their reach. It is building a magnificent, beautiful life and refusing to let them have a single seat at your table. It is stepping out of their way and calmly letting karma collect the massive debts they created all by themselves. I take a slow, satisfying sip of my wine, surrounded by the people who truly love me, knowing my future is entirely my own and my brother finally got exactly what he earned. The hardest lesson I ever had to learn is that sharing DNA with someone does not entitle them to a front-row seat in your life. We are often taught to sacrifice our own peace, our own finances, and our own mental health simply because they are family. But toxic behavior does not get a free pass just because you share a last name. When people actively choose to misunderstand you, belittle your achievements, and demand your subjugation, so they can feel powerful, walking away is not selfish. It is pure self-preservation. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and you cannot force people to respect you when they are committed to using you as their scapegoat. The most empowering thing you can do is take your light, your resources, and your energy completely out of their reach. Build your own magnificent life. Surround yourself with people who celebrate your victories instead of being threatened by them. True family is an action built on mutual respect and unwavering support. And sometimes the sweetest closure is just stepping back and letting karma collect its own debts. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power and walking in your truth.